An author, Stephen Richards, once said, "When you reach out to those in need, do not be surprised if the essential meaning of something occurs." We owe it to our communities to follow the lead and to heed the advice of our keynote speaker, to engage and to focus on those not so traditional clients. We should all be disruptive innovators like our keynote speaker. As she comes to the stage, ladies and gentlemen of the AIA, please join me in welcoming Liz Ogbu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kevin, for that great introduction, and it's great to be here in front of you. I understand that I'm all that stands between you and the end of the conference, and so I want to make sure that we end on a great note. And I know that you've been on a journey of learning lots of different things and being inspired over the last couple of days, and so I hope that what I present to you will continue that and give you that extra push that you need so that when you go back to work on Monday, you really have something that's exciting and compelling to also add to the mix. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do, and hopefully through that you'll start to see a little bit of a lens of how to approach design in different ways. And I wanted to start by telling you a story. So it's a little bit invisible, but I've actually been working with an IV drip of caffeine today, because up until Monday I was actually in Durban, South Africa. And I was there as part of an advisory panel for the Urban Land Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with those panels, essentially it brings together a group of experts on urban development issues, and they go around to different cities around the world, although this was the first of a series that had been happening in South Africa. And they deal with the city around a complex urban issue that the city is negotiating. So in Durban, we were actually working with a transportation node that happens to be where 2/3 of all informal traders in the city also reside. For those of you who've never been to the Global South, informal traders essentially are street traders. Although in Durban, some of them trade actually out on the street and some of them trade within shelters. And so this transportation node was actually slated for redevelopment. Millions of dollars actually are generated just through these traders, but it's actually been in a state of decline over the past decade. And the city was looking to build a new railway station, a shopping mall, et cetera, and they wanted our help to try and figure out what was the best way to do it. So we spent a week on the ground, and typical of an urban development project, we did talk to city officials who were responsible for it, people from the transportation hub, the train station, who dealt with the bus. There's a new BRT coming. But we also talked to the traders. And it's kind of unusual to think of how do you talk to the clients who happen to be the people who inhabit it. They aren't necessarily the ones who are going to pay for your fee. In this case, we did it for free. But how do we incorporate their voices into what's going on? And so it was really interesting in that we heard different stories from them. We heard, I think there's a tendency of, on the ground, you think of these traders and you think of them as people who are just poor and in need of help. But we also heard stories of success. We heard of one woman who had organized a group of 20 traders, and they cleaned the streets because the government had stopped doing it. We also heard of that same group of traders taking fruit and vegetables from their stands every week to cook soup for the HIV patients in the nearby clinic. But that's not to say that they weren't also dealing with issues. They talked to us about the fact that the bathrooms didn't work, that there weren't enough bathrooms. And when the bathrooms did work, they closed at 4, which was hours before any of their traders left the area, leaving a lot of them to have to defecate in the street or in other unsanitary places. We also heard about the fact that there was increased competition from Chinese wholesalers who had set up shop after the World Cup, and that the bylaws of the city were continuing to reinforce their inability to compete at that level. And we heard of their desires to improve their business. They thought of it as a business, not just that they were trading on the streets, and so they wanted things like marketing skills. And most of all, they talked about wanting a better place in which they could be able to do their business. And so as architects, you can sort of think of some immediate things that we could do. We could build new bathrooms for them. We could build trading places for them so that they didn't have to trade out in the rain. But that wasn't going to deal with the policy issues about the fact that the bathrooms closed or weren't maintained properly. It wasn't going to deal with the competition issues, the fact that they had an unfair disadvantage when they were competing against the wholesalers. And so I bring that to the table to say that design does not exist in a silo. It's not enough to do the object. You have to think about all the other things that affect their problems because their problems don't exist in the silo. They go beyond just the bricks and mortar. And so on our team, we had not only designers, such as myself, I also wore a social innovation hat, so I was thinking about how do you take policies and address them to design and social impact. We had somebody who was an urban management guru and could talk about policy. We had an economic development specialist. We had international development specialists. And it really took the combination of all our different ways of thinking to actually come to the table and work with the expertise that we were getting from the traders about their situations and what worked and what didn't, to allow us to propose a series of policy and ideas, including building ideas, that the city could take and start to think about how to approach this area. And so this is just one example that starts to talk about the way in which I frame the world, which is this idea that we can't think of architecture and design as just being about buildings. Because if we talk about our goals of the things that we're doing, which go beyond just things like housing and community spaces, which are things that, arguably in the schools of architecture and our training over the past couple of years we're able to do. But we want to look at things like social cohesion, economic development, health and well-being. Those go beyond the building. And so we can't stop with just the building being our end goal. We have to start to think about how do we design opportunities for impact. And I say this because when we reframe the design problem that we're solving, it actually allows us to go beyond and gives us inspiration for how do we think about the things that we build. When I start to talk about designing opportunities for impact, for me it means that I'm not just wearing the designer hat. There's 4 other hats that come into play. That of the expert citizen, the storyteller, the translator, and the systems thinker. So expert citizen is this great term that came from a book called Spatial Agency, which was published a number of years ago. And all of us are actually expert citizens. We've been trained in some particular type of expertise, and that's what we bring to the table. And what I love about the combination with citizen is that we often think of expertise as something very objective, almost cold, that we'll be able to figure out this problem in a scientific way. But the truth of the matter is that we're all human. We all come with our assumptions and our biases, but we also come with our compassion and our passion and our intuition, and all of those actually make the things that we create even better. And so the idea of an expert citizen is that that's what we should bring to the table. For the communities that we deal with, those are the citizen experts. And so for me, the important thing here is that expert part of the sentence. I think oftentimes we think as designers we're coming in and we're going to help make these places better. The truth of the matter is that the people who live and work in these communities know far more about what it's like to be in these communities than we will ever know. But rarely have they been empowered to think of that knowledge as expertise. And so some of our job is how do we help them bring that to the table, and how do we extrapolate their expertise and translate it into something that can actually inform a design. For the storyteller hat, I think it's a little bit more nuanced in how we think of architecture, but there's actually tremendous power and privilege in the tool of architecture. We're creating something tangible that is out there, and that tangibility actually has impact. There's no such thing as no political act that comes with architecture. Architecture in itself is a political act because it makes a statement. It can be seen. It can be dealt with. It can communicate people's stories. And so this is an image of a day laborer that was part of the project that Kevin mentioned. And in this case, nobody ever thinks about day laborers oftentimes and doesn't think of them in terms of people who are deserving of a space. And so when we did that project, part of the goal was to not only build something that was cool and that could win a lot of awards and be exhibited globally, it was also to do something that would benefit these people and tell their story, tell a story of how they came to the US for a better life, to build for their families and open up a level of conversation that we weren't having at all about the street corners, the gas stations, the Home Depot parking lot. And what we found when we went back to the day laborers with some of the ideas that we had come up with was that it was actually an act of validation. Because for the day laborers, the very fact that we were doing a design for them actually showed that we had seen them. And that was hugely powerful because rarely do they feel seen. And not only had we seen them, but we had been able to take their voices in a way to the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, to the Venice Biennale, to all the places in which I've presented this project, to here, and been able to share that story and open a conversation that most people never have with them. And so that idea of telling people's stories through the things that we design and build is also something that I believe is super important to our work. Translation is also something that builds on this idea of nuance. So I've been really fortunate in that I get to do projects all over the world, and what's really interesting to me is that there are lessons of things that I learn in Nairobi that are actually applicable for projects that I'm doing in San Francisco and New Orleans, and vice versa. I can take things from those places and apply it in Bangladesh or in London. And so this idea of how do we take information and add an additional level of nuance to them and translate them into things that actually factor into design is something that I also believe informs the work that I do, and hopefully through the projects that I show will give you a little bit sense of how to make that happen. And then the final hat, this idea of the systems thinker, actually relates back to the story that I talked about. This idea of how do we look beyond the building. Oftentimes when I'm trying to explain how to think about a system, I talk about the sustainability movement. So if you go into most definitions that are in dictionaries, you'll find defining sustainability in terms of green, saving the planet, making sure that we don't deplete our natural resources. But the original definition of sustainability that a lot of these are based off of actually came out in the late 1980s and was about meeting the needs of the present without sacrificing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Nowhere in there is a mention of green or sustainability. It's all about how do we ensure the world that we have now can still be a benefit to future generations. If we think of sustainability only about the pure environmental aspects, then we could actually say that this is a success. We have a verdant, rich, green tree, so we've totally dealt with sustainability. But this is in an abandoned library in Camden, New Jersey, and I don't think any of us will say that this is an example of a success. And so for me, this idea of sustainability is actually about thinking about the system. How do we talk about not only the environmental aspects, but the social aspects and the economic aspects? And how do we look at that in total so that what's here is not a rich tree, but actually a thriving community? So I've kind of given you a little bit of taste of some of the things I think about in terms of the hats that I wear when I approach a project, and I want to go into deeper. I don't want to keep you here for hours, so we're not going to do all of these projects, but I sort of show it just to show an example of the different things that I work on and the different places that I work on, and I want to tell you the story about two projects in particular, which will kind of show you the spectrum of how these different hats get applied in practice. So the first project is actually one that I did prior to founding a studio. It was when I was working for IDEO.org. For those of you who are not familiar with it, IDEO.org is a sister nonprofit to IDEO, which is a global design and innovation company. It's been around for, IDEO itself has been around for a couple of decades. Got founded around product design, so the first Apple mouse, the first Palm Pilot, which I realize several of you who are under a certain age will not know what I'm talking about. All of that got developed through IDEO. And then about 10 years ago, IDEO switched to using its innovative way of design thinking and human-centered design to look at how do you design experiences, how do you design services. And IDEO.org was formed 4 years ago to take that innovative way of thinking and apply it to poverty-related challenges. And so in this case, we were actually sent to Kenya. And our client was this triumvirate of some really interesting players who came together. Unilever, the global product company, Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, you get what it does, and GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And all of them had a role to play in one or a couple of these particular issues. So there's actually some really significant development issues out there in terms of the fact that millions of people die each year from water-related diseases. We also have millions of kids who die just from diarrheal diseases. And 1 out of 3 people in developing countries have some sort of vitamin and nutrient deficiency, which actually starts to play into things like education, which then plays into productivity, which then plays into GDPs of countries. So it's actually a significant problem. And in Kenya, where each of these global players actually had a firm base, the problems were magnified there. So only 60% of the population had access to reliable water sources. And this number is actually consistent even in Nairobi, the capital. So it means that you could either turn on the tap and get water reliably, not judging the quality of that water, but you could get water, or get it from a borehole. And so only 60% could do this every day whenever they wanted to. You also had diarrheal diseases being in the top 10 causes of morbidity and mortality, and over 80% of the kids had some sort of vitamin A deficiency. And so normally these groups would deal with these problems individually on their own. And what they realized is that maybe it's time we start to combine forces, because these things are actually related to one another. And so they had a brilliant idea to create a social enterprise that would sell water and health products. And they said, awesome, we're good to go. And then they came to IDEO.org because they were like, we have this brilliant idea. We have no idea how to make it happen. And so we went to Nairobi, and we spent 2 weeks on the ground. And our group was actually an interdisciplinary group because there was a belief, just as the example that I mentioned in Durban, that when you bring combined ways of knowledge, you can actually get at better, more innovative solutions. So I sort of wore the architect hat and the ethnographic hat. Somebody else was an industrial designer, but a business designer, and a mechanical engineer. And over that course of time that we were in Kenya, we interviewed over 50 people. And I think this is also very similar to the Durban example, that when we think about the clients who hire us, they're the ones who are paying our bills, and then there's everyone else who's actually dealing with the things that we create. And so part of the process through IDEO.org and also the process I work with in my own practice is how do we start to hear from those diverse stakeholders earlier in the design process so that it actually can better inform the things that we create. So in this case, we talked to people who could be potential customers of whatever it was that we would create. We also talked to entrepreneurs, people who were already selling either water or selling health products. And we also talked to the government agency who was in charge of water delivery, who surprisingly was actually really excited to have this new thing on the marketplace because they knew they weren't going to be able to meet the gap. And then we also did a little bit of prototyping, so actually trying to figure out what would this business look like, which I'll explain a little bit later. So here are some examples of some of our work in the field, both the interviews and the prototyping process. And what we found at the end of the prototyping is that actually the problem that our client had originally sent us to solve was the wrong problem. This idea of creating a business that could sell water and health was not going to fly because people actually really didn't care about the health products, but clean water, that was the pain point. Anytime you said, we'll set up a business to sell clean water, people were like, tell me where, how much can I pay? And so what we realized is that we had to completely rethink the way in which we were designing this business to effectively do the Trojan horse approach of saying the way we were going to get into people's lives was through selling clean water. And through that, we could then start to do health education and products. And what we realized is that we had to think of the way in which we were designing actually as a system. And a lot of this came out of the prototyping process. So prototyping in architecture, you're traditionally at the end of figuring out your design. The design is largely cooked. You just need to test a few things here and there. Prototyping for me and at IDEO.org was a lot closer to what product designers use in terms of prototyping. It's not the end of the design process, it's actually part of the design process. You prototype to learn. You build full scale to learn. Because basically, it de-risks failure. If you wait till the very end to figure out whether something or not works, at that point you've already invested tons of time and money that you can't really backtrack. And so one of the things I look at is how could you build something in real time that allows people to interact with it in different ways. And so in this case, what we found, we did a prototyping day where we actually set up shop as a business that took over a kiosk. We looked at delivery of door-to-door sales, and we looked at the cart sellers and actually having them go and do it. And what we found is that we needed all of those. So when we had just the kiosks, we couldn't address that many people because water is actually really, really heavy. And so the scale of people that we could touch was really small. When we did the mkokotenis, who were the cart sellers, they were not the people you wanted to do health education. They were sort of these brutes, and that's what you need to carry water, but they couldn't communicate how to actually use that water productively or how to take the health products. And the door-to-door saleswoman was great, but she couldn't carry water. And so actually, we needed to design this thing as a system, and all of those pieces were required to actually make the business work. And so as we were thinking about the system and how the different pieces plug in, this project was really interesting for me because for the entire year that I was on fellowship at IDEO.org, I barely touched a building, which as an architect, I'm sure you guys are like, how do you do that? And this project was the first time I got to draw something that approximated a building, so I was very excited. But the thing about it was that we weren't looking at a building in terms of, just a building. We were looking at the building in terms of how does it fit into this overall system. And so it's everything from where are the markings on the building to actually, in our interviews, what we found when we did the prototype is that everybody was asking, how is the water cleaned? It's not that if I explained the reverse osmosis process, they would really understand it, but there was such a huge issue of counterfeit within the Kenyan culture that it was actually really important for them to be able to see the water being clean. And that understanding filtered into the suggestions we made for the building design for whatever they came up with when they actually were launching the business. And so this idea of looking at the object, not just as the object, but something that's part of a system, is something that became really critical to this project. It was the same thing with other design pieces, such as the graphic design. And essentially what we did is we looked at, all of us contributed to looking at the business in its entirety. And we looked at the entire business model, from how this thing was going to make money, to what were the things that it was going to offer, to who were the customers. And all of these were subject to ideas of design. And so we did things like actually offer up to our clients in the 100-page deck that we delivered to them each stage of the process, from the moment that they met their customers to the point at which someone exits the system. And that entire experience, each step of it, was actually designed. And so I think the thing that I want to suggest here with this project is how we expanded the view in which we thought that we as designers could actually touch. We even looked at things about how it was going to make money and breaking that out, and that whole process, again, was designed. At the end, what we turned over to our clients was saying that this is where we are today, but there's a lot more that you have to do before you can launch this business. And so we essentially designed steps for them to talk about how to move forward, the types of questions they needed to ask, the people they needed to interview. At what point did they need to step back in and look how the model was operating and think about how to redesign it, either engaging us or training them. They all came alongside with us during the research process so that they would be able to start to operate as designers in themselves and make decisions. And so for the prototyping, I wanted to also share that just because, as I said, the prototyping for us was not the end of the process, but part of the process and how we learned how to design. So we actually created a fake business while we were in Kenya. We created a brand, and we set up shop at a water kiosk. And it may seem like that was a really silly thing to do, that we had all of this data from the research of interviewing people. But it's really interesting because, as there's a great Henry Ford quote that says, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. People have a certain worldview, and there are things that they tell you that's within that. And you have to find ways to break out of it. And again, this is part of this idea of how do we learn more earlier in the design process and de-risk failure so that by the time we get to the end and do things that are disruptive, we've actually been able to test it along the way. So we set up shop in a community and sold water and health products for a day. And it was really interesting because it allowed us to see how people interacted in a way that actually informed the design. And so when we got to the end, and this is what happened about 6 months after we finished our part of the project, they actually set up shop, and a lot of the things that we learned in the prototype actually fed into it. So one example is that when we were out there, we actually wanted to sell water out of blue jerry cans, which are these water containers, because we thought blue, that symbolizes water. People will totally love this. When we wanted to run the prototype, we couldn't find enough blue jerry cans. We could only find white. That was the only thing you could get in large quantities. So we sort of hemmed and hawed and said, okay, we'll use that. But what we found is that was one of the most popular things that we had that attracted people to us, because they were like, white symbolizes purity. I know your water is clean because of that. We would have never learned that lesson if we had just done it based off of what we heard from people. This actual act of testing real time was super important. The whole thing that I mentioned about the fact of people asking us how the water was cleaned, something we never would have thought about through just our conversations and the initial prep research that we did, but that act of prototyping allowed us to be able to see. So it's maybe hard to see, but the writing that you see on the left side of the screen is actually written on a glass screen, so people can look in and see this guy cleaning the jerry cans and cleaning all the water supplies so that they know that things are actually clean. Again, all this stuff is something that just came out of the prototyping process. And going back today, I've gone back a couple of times through other projects that I've done, and this is actually from the deck that we handed off to them, and they talk about it as the Bible. And so everything that we talked about in terms of designing the experience, they're still using today, and it really helps them in terms of how they think about interacting with people. And so it's not just the spaces that were designed, but it was every single element of the business. And it was something that could only be done in combination, not just with me, but the MBA that we had on the team who understood how the business can work, and the industrial designers who understood how do we fit all of these water supplies into it. And so it's this complex mix of us working together that actually allowed us to create a business that could work. And the thing that is also super interesting to me is this idea of what is our outcome that we're looking for. I think a lot of times when we work on projects, we think about the output, the building, and hopefully that it operates well. But I think there's something about what do we hope to solve at the end of the day. And so what's really interesting with this project is this was one of a series of projects that were done that actually inspired Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, what's up, to actually start to create a whole division that would start to look at disruptive innovation using design. So for me, the rethinking of how we do architecture, this project was great in terms of rethinking the who. So we were not only dealing with our clients, who was a multinational corporation and NGOs, but we were also dealing with the government officials, public health experts, water experts, business strategists, graphic designers, community members. The list actually could go on, but I wanted to keep it on the slide. The how, this idea of working collaboratively and iteratively, but also looking at the idea of design being about the system, not just a business or a building or a graphic strategy. And then the what actually being not setting up the business itself, but how do we actually solve for giving people reliable access to clean water and designing opportunities for healthier lives. So now I want to get to a second project, which is perhaps a little bit closer to what most of you in the room are working on, at least in terms of addressing the building. But again, this is something that starts to tackle this idea of looking at the system. So this is a project that I've been involved with in Hunters Point. For those of you who are not familiar with San Francisco, Hunters Point is on the southeastern edge of the city. It's actually been primarily for much of its life an industrial district, the backwater of the city in a way. So the naval shipyard, which built and deconstructed nuclear ships, is located there. One of the largest sewage treatment plants located near a residential neighborhood is located there. There have been a number of landfills that have been there over its time, a lot of industrial businesses, and more recently, this power plant. And the power plant was owned and operated by PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, and the city and the residents living near this area actually lobbied in the late 90s for this power plant to close. Should also note that this area is one of the poorest districts in the city. It has the highest percentage of public housing in San Francisco, and there is a major public housing development directly above the power plant. And there are huge incidences of asthma and cancer rates. And so it was a group of mothers within this public housing development that led the charge and banded together a lot of community groups to lobby for this plant to be closed, which it finally was in 2005. And over the past 10 years, the plant has been torn down and the land has been remediated. It's about 40 acres. And unfortunately, the traditional remediation strategy is you replace the dirty fill with clean fill, and then you cap it with concrete, and you sit on it until you dispose of the land. The problem is that it was probably going to be about 10 years before they figured out, 5 to 10 years before they figured out how to sell the land and break it up into parcels, because there was a lot of different paper streets and entanglements with the port. But to have 40 acres of concrete that the community that lobbied for this plant to close are looking down on was politically untenable in this area. So PG&E put out an RFP to ask for firms to come together as teams and figure out how to do some sort of interim use strategy that would activate the land while they were waiting to sell for it. And I was part of a team that came together and said, well, we'll deal with this. We're really interested in what is the question of what goes next. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is being on the southeastern waterfront, it's actually prime real estate because most of this has been used for industrial uses. Nothing of this shoreline has really been touched. And so it's actually this really, really beautiful site. And we were trying to figure out, where do we go from here? How do we propose something? And what comes next? And how might that actually inform the long-term development and PG&E's decisions around disposition? We proposed to them that instead of looking at a more retail strategy, which has been really successful in terms of interim use projects elsewhere in the city, that they start to look at a community-based strategy. Economically, it was actually not going to be sustainable to turn this into a retail hub. It was really far away from the core of San Francisco, and you didn't have the economic base in the area. But we said that there were a lot of needs in this community and a lot of groups that were doing stuff that could actually make use of this space. And so what's really interesting is if you go for the quant and you look at the statistics, there's a clear amount of need that we could address. Everything from health disparities to the lack of open space to the fact that this place is a food desert. And we could have gone off of that to try and figure out what we wanted to design. But we really felt that it was important to actually start to talk to people. So to the point of what I made in the previous projects about this idea that we can't just talk to the stakeholders who are the client or the city officials or even the organizational actors. We needed to figure out a way, how do we actually talk to the people who are going to inhabit the spaces that we created? And so we said, we're not going to do a community meeting, because that's normally the way in which we approach these kind of projects. And the problem is, when we go to a community meeting, generally we have things pretty baked out, and we're asking people to comment on them. And so what we wanted to do is find a way to actually draw their expertise, draw their knowledge, and use that to inform our decisions about what we decided to do. And so we started doing interviews in the community, talking to people about the community, trying to understand what was there, what was the need, and then also importantly, what were their desires. I think when we're doing projects, we often talk about need, but desire is just important because it's connected to emotion, and that's what really binds people to a place. And so what we realized very early on is that it was really hard for people to visualize what it was that they wanted, because they'd never been able to be on this site. It was forbidden for most of the time that people were around. And just to that point of the Henry Ford quote, we figured out that what we needed to do was actually find people, a way to bring people to the site earlier. We also found, especially when we talked to the residents of the public housing, that there was this tremendous sense of impending loss. I should also mention that most of the industrial areas in this neighborhood are actually switching over to middle and high income housing. And so this area is rapidly gentrifying. And people felt like their stories were starting to be lost. And there was a lot of rich stuff that had happened here in Bayview Hunters Point, but nobody was ever going to know that. So we concocted an idea and basically hijacked the community engagement money that we were supposed to be using to hold community meetings, and said to our client, can we just build something on the site that's a first step and allows people to come and connects to this desire to be able to tell some of their stories. So we actually teamed up with StoryCorps, the National Storytelling Project, and they have a local booth in San Francisco, and we said, can you come in, if we build you a booth on site, can you come and take some of these stories? Because when we looked in the 5 years that they had been in San Francisco, they only had a handful of stories from this neighborhood. So they said, well, that's kind of a crazy offer, but sure, well, you build us a booth, we'll come and do the recording. So we got a shipping container, we put it on site, we got a bunch of local kids to come and help us. And one of the interesting things is we hired them to do the work, but it wasn't just to involve them in the process of making, but it was a form of interviewing them, bringing them onto site. They talked to us in a way that was much freer than when we tried to get them out in the community. And I should note that one of the things that we consistently heard in our early interviews was people's desires for us to do something for the kids of the community, because they said those guys are the future. You have to figure out something that actually works for them and brings them to the site. So this is what it looked like when it was built, and the inside of the container actually looked like this. And so we actually turned it into a community living room. We wanted it to feel like you were at your grandma's house, and it was a place that you could come and just be comfortable and tell your story. And the window that you see actually looks out over to the old power plant site. So it was this idea that as you're telling your stories of the past and of the present, you're also starting to think about the future as you look out over where the site used to be and what could be there. And so we started in December 2013, and it was really great because we brought tons of people to come in and tell their stories. And for those of you who've never done a StoryCorps recording, essentially you bring a partner who interviews you, and you're in the booth together for an hour, and the only other person with you is the person who's monitoring the sound equipment. And you might think that actually it's impossible to get in deep, but one of the biggest accessories that we need to have in the place, if you can see there's a box of Kleenex on the table, and I swear to God, about 80% of the people who come out of the booth crying. Because it's just been so impactful. You start talking generalities, and then by the end, you're telling these deep and powerful stories. And what's really interesting is that we've been able to use all of those stories as data, because even though we didn't tell people, say what is going to be the future of the site, we just said, tell your life stories. And so as people start to tell about the things that were precious to them in the community, that's actually given us the ingredients that we can start to think about what needs to be on this site to make it a meaningful place for them. I should mention that in this picture is actually one of the people from our client team who happened to grow up in this neighborhood. So we convinced her to bring her brother, and she was weeping. She always weeps whenever she goes into the booth. But it's great because she tells the story of being in that booth to everyone, and so she's been one of the biggest evangelists for this project. I think it's also really important in this idea of how do we connect and be true expert citizens, of putting ourselves in the place of this. So we had several people who came without partners. And so now I've done many StoryCorps interviews because I would hop into the booth. And for me, it was not only a way to hear their stories directly, but to get them to see me not as this mysterious designer, but someone who they can tell their story to. And so our clients laugh because they've been operating in this community for years, and it's been, back and forth. Sometimes it's a contentious relationship. And within the space of the year, whenever we showed up to community events, people would hug us, we'd ask how their kids were, and they were just like, how did you guys get to that? And it was really because we set up this example that we're here not to extract data from you and run off and do our designs, but we're here to design with you, and we want this to be a partnership where we're working together to build what can go here next. So this is kind of what it looks like now. And one of the interesting things is, so originally we did it with this idea of doing the StoryCorps booth, but we actually did it so that we could start to open up the site and make it a staging ground to start to do other stuff. Because once we built it, it was hard for a client to say, no, you can't do anything else there. So we did a whole series of programming in the spring and summer, and the whole idea was, once we realized the success of the StoryCorps booth, we realized, well, let's not go back into the community to try and ask questions through a community meeting or through interviews. Let's prototype and do stuff on the site that helps us think of what kinds of programming can we put here, but also is a way to get people to tell us their stories in different ways and use that information to inform the design of what happens here next. And so the first stage of that was starting to hold what we called listening parties. And so they're modeled off of neighborhood block parties. They're on our site. And in this neighborhood, there's a huge issue with lack of transparency. Everybody sort of feels, oh, that group got money and they didn't do anything with the community. And so one of the things we felt is, as we're collecting these stories, we couldn't just keep them internal. So these listening parties actually became our modified community meeting. We would play edited clips of the recordings. We paid a sound engineer to edit it down so it sounds exactly like what you would hear once a week on your NPR station. And then we'd play the recordings, and then after that, we'd start to do a conversation and brainstorm session about ideas people had. And it's so interesting how the change of people from, if we had just come up with drawings and said, what do you think about this? It really would have been hard for them to discuss with us. But when we played stories of people remembering the amusement park that they used to go to, or how they used to run around in this part of the community, it actually unlocked this whole wealth of information, and people gave us much richer ideas about what they would like to see on the site. And all of that has been super helpful for informing what comes next. We also tried to find ways to ask questions in different ways. And so we had what we called these desire cards. And we engaged in particular youth around this to tell us what would they love a place to have in the community, or what did they feel that their community needs. We also tried to find different ways to engage kids. So, of course, the thing we had heard from the community is do something for the youth and for the kids. But nobody ever asks kids what they want, and it's really hard. So we started to have different events that would bring kids to the site and that would give us an opportunity to ask them. So this is actually from a kite party that we had. We actually teamed up with a local organization and had them go into the schools and do a kite making workshop with kids, where the kite was supposed to reflect what was their dream for the neighborhood. And they got to come to the site and fly the kites around. And so what was really cool was that for many of them, this was not just about flying their kite. It was the first time they'd been able to run free or even fly a kite. And so many of them said, I can't wait to go home and tell my grandmother or tell my mother. And so the interesting thing is that the kids have no memory of this site as a power plant. So in some ways, their dreams of this site are quite pure. And so they'll go home and they'll tell their parents, hey, there's this place that I had a lot of fun. When can we go back to it? And so it's actually a way for us to also pull in their parents to be part of this process. We also asked the kids to be architects for a day. And we asked them to do these little cards that had, if you could put anything on the site, what would it be? And so we got a lot of interesting responses, including a dinosaur park, several water parks, several zoos. And so, of course, we can't replicate a dinosaur park, but actually what we were able to extrapolate from the hundreds of cards that we now have is that the kids wanted something that allowed them to interact with nature. And it's not just be near nature, but actually interact with nature. There's no way we would have been able to ask a kid and they would have been able to tell us that directly. But through this process of figuring out a way that we could ask them and get that information, we were actually able to feed that into our design. And again, one of the things that is super important about this is not just having activities on site, but actually having a way for people to have fun and connect to this place and start to bond with this place already, even though we don't have anything permanent there. The biggest thing we've attempted so far is a circus, and I will not explain the heart attack that my clients had when I said, hey, we've got this great idea, we want to do a circus on the site. But again, it was a way of figuring out how do we change the relationship that people have with the site and use that as a way to think about how do we build into the future. And so it was really interesting because our clients were completely freaking out about this. And so in a way, if we could have this event and have it be successful, it was actually a way to get our clients prepped up to be able to do more innovative things with the permanent thing that would come next. And so we were thinking, yeah, we may have like 150, if we're really lucky, 200 people. And I should put into context the very first event we had prior to doing the StoryCorps thing. We had 5 people show up, and a couple of those were coerced. So to go from that and thinking about what we were doing here, we were really not sure what we were going to come up with. We got 650 people. And the really interesting thing is that we didn't just get people from Bayview Hunters Point, we got people from surrounding communities. It looked like a mini UN. And it's important to note this because Bayview Hunters Point is viewed as a very dangerous neighborhood. It's not one that people living in the middle-class neighborhoods adjacent to it would necessarily think of going to on a Saturday afternoon. So for them to be willing to come into this place also meant that we had changed the dynamic in some way. And it was super interesting because we had several representatives from our clients there. And for them, they were just like, oh my God, I can't believe this. Is this really happening? And everybody still talks about that event and the energy from it and how exciting it was to see there. And the head of government relations for PG&E snapped a photo and emailed it to the CEO for PG&E and the mayor of San Francisco and said, look what we're doing here in Hunters Point. This opportunity has now unlocked our ability to do more things here on this site. And it's this act of prototyping and testing and working not only amongst our team, but also working with different groups in the community, arts groups, youth groups, environmental justice groups, and bringing them to the table as well to think about how can we do things creatively here. I just want to play for a couple minutes a video that we created, again in the spirit of this transparency and the storytelling, which we actually took clips from the StoryCorps recordings and talked about the making of the booth. Oops, sorry.
We have always been set aside like an island, a no man's island. We're right here in Bayview Hunters Point, where the old power plant used to be, something that I grew up with, and going to reminisce about what this is all about, what Hunters Point is all about, and what the people was all about.
What do you want for the future?
What I want to see in the future is my grandchildren being productive citizens. I want them to go to school, to get educated, and to place themselves in the position so that they may help others.
Joy is a result of having a strong sense of who you are, the direction you're going in life, and your overall purpose. By helping others, combining education and community service, communities are healed and streets are healed.
If we think about our history and all we lost, we didn't lose it for nothing, and all of what we do is not in vain. I'm proud to serve this community. I want to see the change, but I also want to see our culture preserved here and our families preserved here. We look out and we see just this space, and the water comes up to the land, and just makes me think of how important it is to preserve our beauty. I don't want to waste time wishing that I did something or said something. To wake up today and be alive and tell you I love you. This is a time for us to talk.
And for us to be here today looking out on the outpost of the beginning of Hunters Point. It's future. This is where the future is. And it will be a success story.
So all all the audio that you see is all from the StoryCorps recordings. And again, we didn't tell them say what you want here, but automatically a lot of the stuff that they said actually just talks about a deep wellspring of emotion that they have for this place, and has actually been the ingredients for how we think about what goes there next. So this is the design for at least the community hub portion of what we're working on. And so this will actually launch by the end of the summer. And this whole process of both extrapolating things from what people were saying, as well as actually watching how people operated on the site, has all been extrapolated and translated into a design brief that then informs this. And what's really cool is that there's a lot of things that we put in this and in some of the stuff that's happening at Shoreline that there's no way we would have ever gotten our client to budge on if we hadn't gone through this process of this year of doing programming, which all came from hijacking our community engagement budget. And now they've actually put in a full budget for us to continue to do this work in the community, and to also design, a part of our brief is also designing some of the programming that will go in here. And so all of that is happening in this next stage. So again, like the other project, it's a huge diversity of folks that we've been working with. There's certain different people who are specific to this, so remediation expert and land use attorneys. And what's really cool, the land use attorney, is that he's now seen the success of what we've done here and has talked about weaving in community benefits into the requests for the RFPs that come up with some of the parcels that will be put out for development. The how, still this idea of working collaboratively and iteratively, and this idea of designing the system. We're not designing just that hub, we're designing this entire way of engaging with the community, the programming that's going in. All of that is needed to actually make this a successful project and outcome. And I also feel very strongly this project's looking at this idea of redefining gentrification. I think normally you might be a typical thing as an architect to say, you know, we're just here to build it, to build these new things that are coming into the community. We can't control what's happening around it. But I think that's actually being somewhat irresponsible. I think that these communities want the same things that the wealthier folks who are moving in want. But rarely is the system structured to try and see how can we give them an opportunity to stay a little bit longer. I can't say from this project whether or not we can guarantee people to be in this neighborhood for a long period of time, but what the imperative with this project is how do we build their capacity to stay? And so that's kind of why we've also adopted this idea of designing the program itself. So how do we bring in health? How do we bring in economic development stuff? And how does that factor into also the physical design pieces? So for me, you know, we've seen this repetitively, but just the who, I really believe that it's about how do we start to think about collaborating not only across disciplines, but also with the people who are going to inhabit the spaces that we create. How do we leverage our power and privilege? So as I said, design is a tool, and I don't know if we use it to the full extent that we can. We have, of course, the folks who are paying us to do the work, but then we have the folks who are the recipients of it, and in some way, we are mediating between that and have an ability to change that course. And embracing the design imperative is basically the way in which I feel that that can play out. So it's not just about designing the building, but going beyond that to do what I sort of call architecture plus. I feel that should be a standard operating procedure for us. This, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Brain Picker, but if you're information obsessed like I am, it's a really great site. And this is actually a tagline, and the blue is a little bit of an amendment for how I describe my practice and the things that I do. A discovery and creativity engine for meaningful knowledge, impact, and justice, fueled by cross-disciplinary curiosity and collaboration. And at the end of the day, I think it's really about, as we talk about telling the stories to people of what it is that we do and helping them understand that a little bit more, I think it's not only about helping them understand, but making sure that our intention in the work that we do, the actions that we put into the work that we do, actually really do affect their lives. And so I think that's not necessarily an imperative that we're going to get from our clients, but it's an imperative that we should give one another. And so when you walk out of this room today and when you walk into your practices, I hope that you'll start to talk about what is it that we can do that, regardless of whether you're working for a street trader or for an office building, that you're actually starting to talk about how do we make impact in the lives of the people who will inhabit the spaces that we create. Thank you.
The American Institute of Architects, designing a better world.